Good evening and welcome to Gravitas. I'm Palki, Sharma, Upadhyay. Let's get started.
Restoring price stability will likely require maintaining a restrictive policy stance for some time.
For months, we've been tracking global economies. We've been telling you about recession fears. On some occasions, they seemed overblown. Every once in a while, there were positive reports like those in India that said inflation had peaked in April. So things look good sometimes. We've seen ups and downs along with a broader trend. Today, the Federal Reserve Chairman of the US sort of put paid to all speculation. He gave an 8-minute speech and soon it wiped out $78 billion of American wealth. Within hours, global markets started falling. Most of them closed in the red today. What is it that Jerome Powells said? That they'll keep hiking interest rates, which means lower borrowing and slower growth. The impact will be global. On Gravitas tonight, as we decode the strategies and the trends, we also want to highlight that this looming recession is as much political as economic. It needs a political solution and central banks alone will not be able to fix this.
Softer labor market conditions will bring down inflation. They will also bring some pain to households and businesses.
Well, we've been talking about recession and the statements that have come in. So I want to start tonight with a question. How much damage can one speech do? I guess it depends on who is giving that speech. Last Friday, it was Jerome Powell's turn. He is the chairman of the US Federal Reserve. It was probably the most important speech of his career, also for the global economy. The markets were looking for some encouragement. Since late June, things have looked relatively better. Inflation was nearing its peak. Stocks were recovering from record lows. All they needed was some sort of clarity from Powell, an indication that he would ease up on monetary tightening. In other words, no more interest hikes. That's what everyone was hoping for. Instead, Jerome Powell delivered a war cry. He promised more rate hikes until inflation cools off.
At some point, as the stance of monetary policy tightens further, it likely will become appropriate to slow the pace of increases. Restoring price stability will likely require maintaining a restrictive policy stance for some time. The historical record cautions strongly against prematurely loosening policy.
For a central bank governor, that's saying a lot. He's not satisfied with small gains. He wants to decisively defeat inflation, and that means a lot of pain, slower growth, fewer jobs, and tighter budgets for smaller households. Basically, the perfect recipe for a recession. Immediately after the speech, we saw some indications. US markets began hemorrhaging money. The Dow Jones closed 3% down. Nasdaq closed almost 4% down and S&P 500 closed 3.3% down. Put together, investors lost a lot of money. America's richest lost around $78 billion. Imagine that. One 8-minute speech and $78 billion wiped out. Elon Musk lost around $5.5 billion. Jeff Bezos, $6.8 billion. Bill Gates, $2.2 billion. Warren Buffett, $2.7 billion. And it's not just the US. Powell's speech sent ripples across Asian markets. India's Sensex closed 1.4% down. Japan's Nikkei was 2.7% down. Taiwan, 2.3%. South Korea's Kospi, 2.2%. The question is, how? How does a policy announcement in the US affect emerging markets? because of three reasons. Number one is borrowing. Most countries still borrow and repay in the US dollar. If the Fed hikes interest rates, that becomes difficult. Governments will have to spend more to service their debt. Reason number two is a sell-off. During such times, capital tends to flee emerging markets. Emerging markets lose money because investors prefer safer bets. For example, US Treasury bonds, they're safe. So all the liquidity heads to the United States, all the money goes there. And finally, reason number three, imported inflation. When the Federal Reserve hikes interest rates, the dollar becomes stronger. Take the Indian rupee, for example. Today, it briefly touched 80 against the US dollar, which means imported inflation. Anything that you buy from outside of India, becomes more expensive. It could be raw materials, it could be finished goods or services. Anything that you import. Some of the bigger economies are relatively insulated from these ripples, like China, India and Japan, but others will feel the pinch, like Argentina, Turkey, South Africa. It will come down to the Federal Reserve's next policy announcement. It's due in September, and by then, they will have more data to chew on. America's jobs report will be out on September the 3rd. The August inflation numbers will be out on the 13th. If the data is good, it could be a 50 basis point hike, if not another 75 basis point hike, and a third one in a row. Now, all these hikes are aimed at cooling inflation, at bringing prices down. But the obvious risk is recession. These measures could trigger a recession when you have more aggressive hikes. You could stall the global economy, especially in the current condition. You see, central banks have limited tools to tackle inflation. Their biggest weapon is liquidity. That's basically cash flow in the market. They want to control that. If you hike interest rates, borrowing will come down. If borrowing comes down, so does liquidity. And if liquidity comes down, so will inflation. That's the basic rule of economics. But this inflation is different. Its major cause is not complicated macroeconomics. This is a geopolitical issue. I'm talking about the war in Ukraine. Energy disruptions are driving this inflation, and central banks cannot control that. Not the Federal Reserve, not the Reserve Bank of India, not the Bank of England, none of them. Which brings us to the front line in Europe. Winter is slowly creeping up on the continent. Experts say it could be a deadly one because energy bills are going through the roof. Benchmark gas prices are up 550%. In the UK, energy bills will rise 80% by October. Britons could be spending 10% of their income on fuel and heating. Most analysts believe a recession is inevitable in Europe. The question is, how deep will that recession be? Will it end after the winter, or will it persist longer? Frankly, a lot depends on how the war unfolds. Right now, the sanctions have derailed Europe's economy. Inflation is in double digits. Energy bills are rising and industries are slowing down. Russia has cut gas supplies to 20% of the normal capacity. Any lower, and Europe will go dark. So the politicians are panicking. In most countries, they've announced strict rationing, no street lights, no ironing, limited air conditioning. The idea is to squeeze every ounce of energy to save it. But will the people go along? After all, this is not their war. If the crisis escalates during winter, there could be public pushback, even protests across Europe, and Vladimir Putin is banking on that. He's hoping that the energy crisis will force Europe to stop supporting Ukraine. Like I said, this is not a macroeconomic crisis, it's a political issue. You have China and Russia creating new economic frameworks, almost de-globalizing their economy. You have lingering effects from the pandemic, like broken supply chains or rising health costs. And to top it all, you have multiple conflict zones. There's one in Ukraine, another brewing in Taiwan. When inflation is driven by such political issues, central banks have very little wiggle room. They can keep hiking interest rates, but that alone cannot cool inflation. The current global economic crisis needs a political solution. Now, does Xi Jinping enjoy absolute power? Does he ever face any protest in China? Those who follow China often grapple with these questions. Many of you have written to us asking the same. Does he have any meaningful opposition? How can a country of more than 1.4 billion people not have a challenger to Xi Jinping? Well, sometimes we get reports of dissent in the Communist Party of China, but they never amount to anything. Tonight, though, we come to you with a different story. You could call it the most meaningful dissent that Xi has faced in his tenure. Tonight, we have a rare dissent note, an open letter written by 3 insiders. And this letter targets the Chinese president in a way we have never seen before. Radio Free Asia has published this report. Leading China watchers are all talking about it. This is the story they've published. Letter says Chinese Communist Party is too powerful, warns against personality cult. The letter does not name Xi Jinping, but the allusion is evident. There is only one leader with a personality cult in today's China, and that leader is Xi Jinping. And this letter is a scathing attack on his grip on power. It's getting a lot of attention because the authors are high profile. They're said to be 3 officials of the Communist Party, Dong Hong, Yi Ma Gui Chuan, and Tian Chi Zhuang. Who are these people? We've not been able to verify their credentials, but this report says that they're party elders. That's how it refers to them, as party elders. Meaning they're senior members of the Communist Party of China. They've held senior positions in the government. You can think of them as retired officials who now advise the government. That's exactly what they seem to be doing here in the letter, advising the Communist Party of China. These party elders are calling for sweeping changes. They want the Communist Party's charter amended. Their objections are very specific. They're against the unlimited power of the Communist Party. They refer to the party constitution specifically about a recent amendment. And this amendment was added in the year 2017. And this change was quite controversial. It said that the party will lead, quote unquote, everything in China. Let me tell you what the amendment says. It says the leadership of the CCP is the fundamental feature and the greatest advantage of socialism with Chinese characteristics. Party, government, military, civilian and academic, east, west, south, north and center, the party leads everything. Now, interesting fact. This exact phrase, the one that I just read out for you, was coined by Mao Zedong, the father of modern-day China. It was removed during the Deng Xiaoping years. Xi Jinping brought it back. It was meant to underline his absolute power, and now he's facing a backlash over it. Let me quote more from the dissent note. This is what the party leaders say about that sweeping amendment from 2017. This phrase first appeared during the Cultural Revolution on Mao Zedong's instructions so as to restore order as soon as possible, but has no wider meaning. The main problem the country faces today is that the party committees have too much power and their reach is overly long. For the party to lead everything goes against common sense and against logic. So those are the objections. And this is basically a scathing attack on Xi Jinping's leadership style. Remember, he holds all key positions in the Chinese government. Xi Jinping is the president of China, which makes him the head of the Chinese state. He is also the general secretary of the Communist Party. This position comes with extraordinary powers. The general secretary is the highest ranking official in the country, in China. He can convene meetings of top decision-making bodies. He is also in charge of the secretariat that looks after day-to-day work. And that's not all. Xi Jinping also holds another powerful post. He is the chairman of the Central Military Commission, which makes him the de facto head of the Chinese military too. So the Chinese state, the Communist Party, and the Chinese military, all of them report directly to Xi Jinping. And this centralization of power is exactly what the party leaders are worried about. They believe this could have dire consequences. Again, I quote from their letter. This is what they've said. The cult of personality is likely to make a comeback and the tragedy of the Cultural Revolution may be repeated. Quite a grave warning. The Cultural Revolution, again, was started by Mao. He used it to purge his enemies and establish complete control over China. The campaign went on for a decade. As many as 2 million people are said to have died during this time. It was one of the darkest periods in Chinese history, the Cultural Revolution. And now, Communist Party leaders are worried that that period could return. That's because Xi Jinping won't tolerate dissent. In the month of May this year, he threatened the top leadership. There was growing opposition against zero COVID, especially after the draconian lockdown in Shanghai. China was reporting its worst outbreak in Wuhan. We told you about all of this. People had started questioning the feasibility of zero COVID, and that was when Xi Jinping issued a warning. Here's what he said. We will resolutely struggle against all words and deeds that doubt distort and deny our epidemic prevention policies. So the message was quite clear. Do not question zero COVID. That's what Xi Jinping was telling his people and the party leaders. Despite his tough stance, he could not crush all voices of dissent. In recent weeks, the Communist Party has faced several protests. People have taken to the streets. Last month, hundreds of depositors launched a campaign that lost their deposits due to bank failures. The Chinese state responded with a violent crackdown. Then there was a major mortgage boycott. Home buyers stopped paying their EMIs. That's because the builders had not given them their apartments. 320 projects in 100 cities were affected. We don't know if these loan repayments have resumed or not. Today, the Communist Party of China is struggling with a long list of problems: a financial crisis, the collapse of the property sector, an unprecedented drought, sweeping power cuts, and of course, a raging Wuhan virus. The conditions are ripe to fuel dissent. Perhaps that is what emboldened these party leaders, these party elders, to write a letter of dissent. It is a rare and bold critique of the Chinese leadership. You see, the Chinese Communist Party is surprisingly candid about its true intentions when it comes to issues like Taiwan or Hong Kong or taking on the US or claiming disputed territories. But as an organization, the Communist Party is opaque. The inner workings are never made public. Even more rare are voices of dissent being made public. And when such voices do get out, it never ends well for the dissenters. Since Xi Jinping took power, he has purged hundreds of his potential, even imagined rivals and dissenters. So perhaps the authors of this letter will also meet the same fate. We do hope they're safe. And we hope what they've said finds takers in Xi Jinping's China. Our next story is also to do with China, and it begins with a flashback. The year is 2015. Chinese President Xi Jinping was on a visit to Britain. He was given a royal welcome in London, and I mean this literally. The Chinese president rode a gilded carriage to Buckingham Palace. He was treated with the best food and wine. In the background, Scottish bagpipers played Chinese folk songs. The Queen herself was toasting with Xi. Now, all of this indicated Britain's political priorities. If they're flaunting the Queen, it means you're important. Back then, David Cameron was the Prime Minister of Britain. He always advocated closer ties with China. In 2015, he took Xi Jinping out for beer and chips, almost like two buddies meeting up after college. Cameron then declared a golden era in relations with China. Listen to this.
This visit marks the start of a new era. Some have called it a golden era in relations between Britain and China. An era of stronger economic ties, deeper trade links, closer relations between our peoples, and meaningful dialogue on the issues that matter to us both.
How wrong he was. Today, relations between China and Britain are near rock bottom. In fact, it's an election issue in the UK. Both Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak are promising a tough line on China. Sunak fired the first shot. He called China the #1 threat to domestic and global security. And now Liz Truss has joined in. She plans to officially declare China as a national security threat. How would that work? Last year, Britain conducted a foreign policy review. That document called China a systemic competitor. Not a rival, a competitor. Liz Truss plans to do another review if elected as the Prime Minister. She wants to designate China as an acute threat. Now, to give you some context, Russia is also designated the same way. For the UK, Russia is an acute threat, officially. It tells you how Britain's policy has evolved in 7 years. In 2015, China was seen as a partner, hence the golden era. By 2021, that sentiment changed. China was declared a systemic competitor of Britain, and pretty soon it could be declared a threat. Rishi Sunak himself has changed his position on China. Initially, he supported closer ties. As finance minister, he led trade talks with Beijing. He even came close to signing a deal with them. But Sunak, the prime ministerial candidate, is much tougher. He sees China as a threat. And now this pivot raises a couple of questions. Number one, why is it happening? And number two, what will it look like? Let's deal with the first question. The China of 2022 is not the China of 2015. It's a lot more assertive, a lot more aggressive, and a lot harder to do business with. Take Hong Kong, for instance. In 1997, it was handed over by Britain to China. They were promised one country, two systems. But 2 decades later, that promise has been broken. Hong Kong is effectively a Chinese province. Same in Xinjiang. More evidence has emerged of the atrocities against Uyghur Muslims, about forced sterilizations, systemic rape, and human experimentation. So Britain, like most countries, had a choice: ignore the abuses in favor of trade or rethink bilateral ties. Right now, Britain is going with the second option. And don't mistake this for righteousness. This is more about playing to the gallery. That's what London is doing. Another reason is Brexit. Since 2020, Britain has lost its clout in global politics. It's not a member of the European Union anymore. For a former empire, that is bad news. This is a country that craves for political relevance. In fact, that was the whole point of Brexit. So what does Britain do? Plunge into the new geopolitical flashpoint, the Indo-Pacific. They have a history of doing this. In 2003, Britain blindly followed the US into Iraq. Other European powers stayed away, but not Britain. And we all know how that ended. 19 years later, they're doing the very same thing, following the Americans into the Indo-Pacific. Last year, Prime Minister Boris Johnson announced new deployments to the region, 2 patrol vessels for at least 5 years. He also deployed a carrier strike group to the South China Sea. It was led by HMS Queen Elizabeth. But the biggest move was AUKUS. Britain joined the US in creating a new military pact for the Indo-Pacific. They agreed to share nuclear submarine technology with the Australians. And all of this indicates a pivot. Clearly, the era of chariot rides and beer is over. The question is, what comes next? A quick decoupling looks highly unlikely. China-UK trade is worth more than $100 billion. Out of this, imports to Britain are worth nearly $73 billion. So the trade is stacked in China's favor. Same with investments. Last year, Chinese companies pumped $4 billion into the UK. And that sort of trade cannot be abandoned overnight. Having said that, Britain seems way ahead of Europe. The EU, you see, is still struggling to define China. Is it a competitor? Is it a rival? Is it a threat? Their member states simply cannot decide. At least Britain's leaders have some clarity. More clarity than the EU, certainly. Chances are their China policy will mirror America's. What does that mean? It means more patrols in the Indo-Pacific, tougher statements on Taiwan and Hong Kong, sanctions over Xinjiang perhaps, and trade and investment curbs in the future. Remember, the UK did ban Huawei from their 5G infrastructure. As for China, it's a point to ponder. 7 years earlier, they were seen as partners. Now they're being called a threat. It tells you that there are limits to economic and commercial power. Trade is not a substitute for political alignment. Our next story is from Pakistan. It's reeling under extreme floods. The deluge has gripped almost all provinces of the country. Pakistan, their government is distributing aid, but that money is not proving to be enough. It says it needs international assistance for recovery efforts. Global bodies are donating generously, but an IMF bailout is yet to be disbursed. What is causing the delay? The government of Pakistan has found a new villain, the PTI, Imran Khan's party. They say the PTI is trying to sabotage the bailout agreement with the IMF. They've also released some audio tapes as proof. They allegedly reveal how the PTI is trying to derail the IMF deal. Here's a report.
Overflowing rivers, sliding highways, collapsing hotels, submerged cities, inundated farmlands, shattered homes, anguished people, and a helpless government. Pakistan is in a state of mess. From the mountains of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa to the lush fields of Punjab to the alluvial plains of Sindh. Even the arid deserts of Balochistan. Floods have spared no part of Pakistan. They've devastated the entire country. It's being called a climate catastrophe. Tens of millions have been displaced. 700,000 homes have been destroyed. And over 1,000 people have lost their lives. Those who have survived are scrambling for food, drinking water, and shelter. The Prime Minister is airdropping aid himself.
From the central government, I announce a grant of 10 billion rupees for the Balochistan province. The National Disaster Management Authority, along with provincial government, will plan the relief works.
The army chief is touring flood-hit areas, trying to comfort displaced people and asking the world for relief.
Friendly countries will also come forward to help Pakistan in this hour of need. And I also appeal on behalf of Government of Pakistan, on behalf of people of Pakistan, to our expats and our friends abroad to please come forward and help these people who are in very, very difficult situations.
Global bodies and Pakistani expats have donated generously, but it won't be enough for recovery. Even before the flood, Pakistan's economy was struggling to stay afloat. It has been trying to secure an IMF bailout. A $1.18 billion loan tranche. It was promised 2 months back, but it's yet to get a final approval. Why? The government of Pakistan is blaming political opponents at home. It's accusing the opposition of trying to sabotage the deal. An audio tape has been leaked. It apparently reveals how leaders from Imran Khan's party are trying to derail the IMF program. The leaders in conversation are Shaukat Tareen, Pakistan's former finance minister, and Mohsin Leghari, the current finance minister of the PTI government in the Punjab province. Listen to this.
Sir, kaise hain aap? जी, अस्सलामुअलैकुम सर, एक मिनट, I can ask the secretary to draft something. जो IMF को ये 750 बिलियन का जो कमिटमेंट दी है, आप सबने साइन करके दिए हैं. तो आपने अभी कह देना है कि जनाब वाला जो हमने कमिटमेंट दी थी वो फ्लड से पहले थी, अब फ्लड पे हमें बहुत पैसे खर्च करना पड़ेंगे, तो इसलिए हम आपको ये बता रहे हैं अभी से कि वी विल नॉट बी एबल टू ऑनर आवर कमिटमेंट. बिल्कुल यही लिखना है आपने, और कुछ नहीं करना. तो वो जो है ना, दैट्स ऑल वी वांट. वो उनको इनके ऊपर जो प्रेशर पड़े इस के ऊपर, ये अपना खुदू खींच रहे हैं, हमें अंदर करवा रहे हैं, हमारे ऊपर टेररिज्म की चार्जेस कर रहे हैं, और ये बिल्कुल स्कॉट फ्री जा रहे हैं. वो नहीं होने देना ना हमने.
In another leaked audio tape, Shaukat Tareen allegedly has the same conversation, this time with Taimur Khan Jagra, the finance minister of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa.
शौकत साहब, अस्सलाम वालेकुम. सर, वो आपने खत बना लिया? अभी मैं बनाता हूँ. उसमें आई हैव एन ओल्ड लेटर. मैं रास्ते में आसिफ कैसे अभी बना के आपको बना ले. उसके बीच में सबसे बड़ा जो पहला पॉइंट बना लेना आप. दूसरे तो आपने पहले बनाए हुए, वो बनाएंगे. जो फ्लड्स आए हैं इन्होंने पूरे उसका बेड़ा गर्क कर दिया है खैबर पख्तूनख्वा का. तो हमें उसको रिहेबिलिटेशन के लिए बहुत पैसे चाहिए.
The tapes have triggered a firestorm. First, the PTI said they were doctored, but a confession by its own ministers has left it embarrassed. This episode is a sorry commentary on Pakistan, where power-hungry politicians don't hesitate in exploiting a tragedy. As of today, Pakistan's biggest enemy is Pakistan itself. Bureau Report, WION, World is One.
Pakistan's problems don't end there. They're facing neighbor troubles to the north, courtesy the Taliban. On paper, they're a match made in heaven. Pakistan uses terror as a state policy. The Taliban use terror as their only policy. But recently, things have escalated. The issue seems to be American drones. The US is carrying out airstrikes against terror targets in Afghanistan. The most important strike took place last month. A US drone took out Al-Qaeda chief Ayman al-Zawahiri. He was living in Kabul at the time. The US claims Zawahiri was killed in that drone strike, but the Taliban claim no body has been recovered from the site. Now, this raises questions about the US strike. Did it really hit the Al-Qaeda chief? And where exactly are those drones coming from? The US does not have a military base in the region. Their closest one is in the Gulf. Now, if the drones did come from West Asia, which route did they take? Reports say they came via Pakistan. They flew over Pakistan. Now, this is the possible route taken by US drones flying to Afghanistan, from Dubai to Karachi and from Karachi to Quetta, and then over the border to Afghanistan. There is nothing new about this arrangement, if this is indeed what happened. After invading Afghanistan in 2001, US forces consistently used Pakistani airspace. Their fighter jets, their drones, their transport aircraft, all of them flew over Pakistan. And reports say that arrangement is still in place. Just one problem though, the Taliban are not happy about it. They're asking Pakistan to stop sharing its airspace.
Our information indicates that the US drones are entering Afghanistan from Pakistan and using the airspace of Pakistan. We demand Pakistan not to use its airspace against us.
Pakistan has denied that charge. They say the US is not using their airspace. Neither side is famous for transparency or facts, so it's hard to say who is telling the truth. Instead, let's focus on the larger picture. Why are Pakistan and the Taliban sparring? In April this year, Islamabad launched airstrikes on Afghanistan. They hit targets in Kunar and Khost provinces. The reason? Retaliation for attacks by Pakistan's homegrown Taliban, the TTP, the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan. Islamabad was expecting more help from the new regime in Kabul. After all, there are links between the two Taliban. Their ideology is similar. There are common Sunni links, even familial ties between the rank and file. But the Afghan Taliban have not been willing to help. They did mediate a ceasefire, but they have not been willing to use force, and that decision has irked Pakistan. So that's one sticking point. Another reason is the border. Pakistan recognizes the Durand Line as the official border between Afghanistan and Pakistan. The Taliban do not recognize that. In fact, no Afghan government can ever recognize that line, the Durand Line. They believe the Pashtun territories held by Pakistan rightfully belong to Afghanistan. So put together, it's been a bad investment. No help against the TTP, no recognition of the border. The Afghan Taliban are playing hardball with Islamabad. The question is why? After all, Pakistan is the Taliban's godfather. They supported both their conquests of Kabul. So why has the relation soured? Perhaps because it's not beneficial anymore. In the 1990s, the Taliban was a pariah. They needed Pakistan for aid and weapons. And back then, Pakistan could afford it. They were the most important American partner in South Asia. That meant a lot of military and financial aid, which is not the case anymore. The new Taliban regime has more options, better options. China, for one, is willing to invest in the Afghan economy. Russia is warming up to them. And compared to that, Pakistan is powerless. Their economy is on the verge of collapse. Their politics is fractured. And Western aid has disappeared. So naturally, there is friction. Does this mean there will be a breakup? Well, that seems unlikely at the moment. The Pakistani deep state has firm ties within Taliban factions, especially the Haqqani network. Militarily too, Pakistan holds the edge. Their capabilities are far beyond the Taliban's. So right now, a breakup looks very unlikely. At the same time, it may not be a return of the 90s. Back then, Pakistan controlled the Taliban. They used Kabul as a proxy capital. Indications are that may not be the case anymore. Needless to say, India will be watching. Now, next story is about a launch that was not to be. NASA's Artemis 1 lunar mission. It was supposed to take off today, but it could not due to a last-minute glitch. So the US Space Agency had to postpone what they were calling the historic launch. Why historic? Because it was the first lunar mission in 50 years, since 1972. Neither NASA nor any other space agency in the world has sent humans back to the moon. So why do they want to do it now? What were the objectives of this mission and why did it fail? Here's a report.
It was supposed to create history, mark NASA's return to the moon with a thunderous liftoff. But it turned out to be a dud.
This is Artemis Launch Control with an update. Launch Director Charlie Blackwell-Thompson has called a scrub.
The much-awaited Artemis 1 launch had to be called off at the last minute, just moments before it was going to take off, all thanks to a malfunctioning engine. NASA engineers say they found a crack in one of the engines of their space launch system. This put the entire plan in peril. They had no choice but to postpone it. It was an embarrassing scrub, especially given the excitement around it. Tens of thousands were waiting to see the Artemis 1 soar. Some had even assembled at a nearby beach with drinks and binoculars.
planned this trip for a long time and, had to postpone it because they kept postponing this. But here I am. I'm excited like a little kid.
The U.S. Vice President was there too. She had flown to Florida with her husband to witness history being created.
Space Council, I can tell you I'm so proud of what is happening in terms of our space program and the leadership that the United States is providing to the world.
In the end, they were all left disappointed. This launch had been decades in the making. Seeing it fail again was disheartening for many Americans. The question is, what makes the Artemis 1 mission so complex? 3 reasons. 1. It's NASA's first lunar program in 50 years. Since the Apollo 17 mission in 1972, NASA hasn't returned to the moon. Neither has the rest of humanity. So the stakes are high. NASA wants to secure all bets. It wants this mission to be bigger than the last one.
Talking about the interior volume here, so it's a 50% more habitable volume than Apollo. It's a 30% larger spacecraft. Something really unique about Orion are the seats fold in stow. So there is actually a lot more room than you would think.
Reason number 2. This mission is not supposed to just take humans to the moon. The aim is to usher a new era of lunar exploration, make astronauts live and walk on the lunar surface, and also lay the groundwork for a mission to Mars. NASA wants to be doubly sure of all the odds.
This first mission is our first test of our deep space transportation systems before we put crew on them. It is foundational in that sense that we need to learn about the vehicles before we put crew on them for Artemis 2. It also sets us up long-term at the moon and on our Artemis campaign going to Mars.
The third reason is geopolitics. It's not just NASA that wants to go to the moon. In recent years, China, India and Israel, they've all tried sending robotic missions on the moon. A South Korean orbiter is also on the way. So NASA wants to stay ahead of the curve, be the first to establish exclusive zones and eventually dictate rules of conduct. NASA's statements betray the motives.
We're going to be sustainable this time. That doesn't mean we're staying 365 days a year. It means we're going to be able to stay for 30 days and help enable others to stay there while we're not there.
But for all of NASA's plans and efforts, Artemis 1 just will not take off. The original launch was scheduled in December 2016. 16 attempts and 6 years later, NASA is still struggling with technical issues. All eyes are now on the 2nd of September. That's the next window for a possible launch. Bureau Report, WION, World is One.
Indian diplomats are known for their carefully worded statements, for being diplomatic, especially when it comes to China. Throughout the ongoing border standoff, India has exercised caution. It chose to settle differences quietly through diplomatic engagements. But this week, there was a major shift in India's tone. There was what we call a war of words. It began in Sri Lanka. The Chinese ambassador to Colombo provoked India. This is about the Yuan Wong 5, the Chinese ship that recently docked at Sri Lanka's Hambantota port. There are serious security concerns about the ship. It has been linked to the Chinese military. Apparently, it has the ability to snoop on key Indian installations. So India expressed strong objections. Sri Lanka refused to let the ship dock at Hambantota. China built more pressure. Sri Lanka relented. Within days, the ship was allowed to come. But it did not conduct any research activities in Sri Lanka. And that should have been the end of the story for the moment. But China was not done. Their ambassador, Chi Zhen-hong, wrote an article for a leading Sri Lankan daily, and this article did not mention India, but the reference to India was quite clear. Allow me to quote from what he said. This is from the Sri Lankan ambassador. In the middle of this month, with China and Sri Lanka having altogether resisted the rude and unreasonable interference from third parties, the Chinese scientific research vessel Yuan Wong 5 has successfully docked at the Hambantota port for replenishment after receiving the latest approval from the Sri Lankan government. Note what he says. The rude and unreasonable interference from third parties. This is a clear reference to India. The Chinese are talking about India here. They also compared the docking of the ship to the situation in Taiwan, which makes no sense whatsoever. How are the two issues related at all? The Indian mission in Colombo decided to respond, and it slammed the Chinese ambassador. India said he has violated, quote-unquote, basic diplomatic etiquette with this article. Allow me to quote from the Indian statement. His view of Sri Lanka's northern neighbour may be coloured by how his own country behaves. India, we assure him, is very different. His imputing a geopolitical context to the visit of a purported scientific research vessel is a giveaway. The statement ends with a veiled attack on Chinese debt traps, and I'm quoting further, opaqueness and debt-driven agendas are now a major challenge, especially for smaller nations. Recent developments are a caution. Very interesting. What about that comparison with Taiwan? The Indian statement weighed in on that too. It accused Beijing of militarizing the Taiwan Straits. And this, I must say, has happened for the first time. Never before has India spoken so candidly about the situation in Taiwan. The choice of words is significant. Again, look carefully. The Post says, militarization of Taiwan Straits. In a way, New Delhi is holding China responsible for the growing tensions in the region. And China will not like this one bit. And this is becoming a bit of a trend. China has been unhappy about some recent Indian statements. A couple of weeks back, the Chinese embassy in India released a statement, and they had basically made a demand from New Delhi. This is what it said, the Chinese in Delhi. We hope that the Indian side could openly reiterate its One China policy like many other countries. The One China principle is the political foundation of the China-India relations. Let me decipher that for you. The Chinese side wanted India to reaffirm commitment to the One China policy. And yes, India has followed this One China policy since the year 1949. And why do the Chinese want a reassurance? Because India no longer uses that term, One China, in its statements. And this is not a recent change. New Delhi has not mentioned One China in its official statements since the year 2010. That's more than a decade. Listen to how India reacted to the Chinese embassy's remarks this time.
We urge the exercise of restraint, avoidance of unilateral actions to change the status quo, de-escalation of tensions, and efforts to maintain peace and stability in the region. India's relevant policies are well known and consistent. They do not require reiteration.
Again, there is no mention of Taiwan, but no mention of One China either. What does that tell you? This is a game of wits. This ambiguity from India is deliberate. Beijing sees it as a snub. And we see it as tit for tat, perhaps. When China does not care about Indian sovereignty, why should India care about One China policy? Why should it appease Beijing? And with its latest statement on Taiwan, India is further drifting away from its One China position, though officially there is no change. But for India to reiterate it, that's what China is asking for. It knows what it needs to do to fix this. It must withdraw its troops from the border and stop threatening Indian sovereignty. But knowing China, that may be hoping for too much. We'll see where this goes. We end tonight's show with a story that's far less complicated. It's a story about a very simple question. What makes a family? Is it only blood relations and marriage? Or can relations based simply on love be called family too? India's top court, the Supreme Court of India, is making a case for broadening the definition of family. It recently observed that unmarried partners and queer relationships can be familial relationships too. The court said that while such units may be atypical, they are as real as traditional families. Here's a report.
What is a family? Depends on who you ask. Legally, blood or marital relations make a family. Convention says a mother, a father, and children make a nuclear family. People say friends are family. India's top court is making a case for broadening the definition of family. It says Familial relationships may take the form of domestic, unmarried partnerships or queer relationships, meaning an unmarried couple is family, so is a same-sex couple. The court was hearing a unique case. A government employee was denied maternity leave. Why? Because she had previously availed leave to take care of her husband's child from a previous marriage. Her situation was atypical. So what did the court do? It granted her maternity leave. The court said, the black letter of the law must not be relied upon to disadvantage families which are different from traditional ones. India's Supreme Court batted for atypical families. It said the family structure may change over time, be it through death or divorce. Also, there are families that may not adhere to societal expectations. Should such families not get legal protection or social welfare? The court said, these manifestations of love and of families may not be typical, but they are as real as their traditional counterparts. Such atypical manifestations of the family unit are equally deserving not only of protection under law, but also of benefits available under social welfare legislation. The observation is significant. It is progressive. They say for the law to remain relevant, it must change with time. And India's top court is signaling its openness to change. It is raising uncomfortable truths like the unfair burden on women. The court says, gendered roles assigned to women and societal expectations mean that women are always pressed upon to take a disproportionate burden of childcare work. Women in India spend up to 352 minutes per day on unpaid work. And this is 577% more than the time spent by men. Should a woman pay a penalty to be a mother? No, says the court. Its observations lay the groundwork for giving legal rights to women who choose surrogacy or adoption to become mothers. It says women, quote-unquote, take on the role of motherhood in ways that may not find a place in the popular imagination. This observation is also being seen as a step towards legalizing same-sex marriage. India decriminalized homosexuality in 2018, but it does not recognize same-sex marriage. Now, India's top court has said that queer relationships are family as well. So, coming back to the question, what makes a family? You could say love. Love is what makes a family.
And now let's take a look at what else is making news across the world. This is Gravitas Global Headlines.
Iraq army announces a curfew in Baghdad after supporters of powerful Iraqi cleric Muqtada Sadr stormed the Republican palace following his announcement that he is quitting politics. The local governor said Russian missiles struck the city center of Ukraine's second largest city, Kharkiv. The governor said 2 missiles hit the surroundings of the Kharkiv Regional Administrative Building, which was struck the first time in early March. The UN nuclear watchdog will inspect the Russian-held Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant in Ukraine this week. This comes after months of negotiations in which the IAEA sought to gain access to the facility, which Ukrainian staff are operating under the orders of Russian forces. 3 consecutive strong earthquakes, the highest one being of 6.1 magnitude, jolted Indonesia's Sumatra island. There have been no reports of casualties. The Czech Industry and Trade Minister has said EU energy ministers will hold urgent talks on September 9th as prices spiral across Europe following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. French carrier Air France suspends 2 pilots after a heated disagreement in which inappropriate gestures were exchanged in the cockpit of a Geneva-Paris flight in June. A Peruvian judge has ordered President Pedro Castillo's sister-in-law to be held in prison up to 2.5 years. She is being investigated for criminal association and corruption. Sri Lanka's president is set to slash expenditure when he presents the interim budget to see the crisis-ridden country through the rest of the year. Rory McIlroy becomes the first golfer in history to win 3 FedEx Cup titles. The 4-time major winner overturned a 6-shot deficit in the final round of the Tour Championship to stun world number 1 Scotty Scheffler and also pocketed a check of $18 million. Karim Benzema scored a brace in the final few minutes to give Real Madrid a 3-1 victory against Espanyol. The defending champions have won the first 3 games of the season and sit at top of the table with 9 points.
That it's a wrap. We're leaving you with Gravitas Images. Thanks for watching.